Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Luke Patterson, and I should have forgotten the case of Khloe Davis, but something brought me back to that cursed forest. It had been 4 months since the 22-year-old photography student vanished from the Blackwood Trail in Olympic National Forest. 4 months since the search teams gave up. 4 months since I filed that final report marked missing person, case suspended. 4 months of waking up at 3 a.m. with her mother's broken voice echoing in my skull. Please don't stop looking for my baby. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October 2018, just as I was kissing my wife Emma goodbye and watching our 8-year-old daughter Lily chase the school bus down our gravel driveway. My iPhone X buzzed with an unknown number. Ranger Patterson. The voice was barely a whisper. This is Margaret Davis, Khloe's mother. My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. In the background, I could hear my daughter's laughter mixing with the morning birds, and suddenly it felt obscene. All this normalcy while somewhere in those woods a mother's heart was still breaking. Mrs. Davis, she called me. The words hit like ice water. Last night, 3:17 a.m. I have it on my phone log. She said she was lost in the white dress and that someone was coming for her. My hand tightened on the phone. Cell towers had been pinging nothing from Khloe's number since March 15th. The carrier confirmed it. Her phone had been dead for months. Mrs. Davis, maybe someone found her phone, or it was her voice. The certainty in those 4 words made my chest tighten. 17 years I've been hearing that voice say "Good morning, Mama" every day until March. I know my daughter's voice, Ranger Patterson, and she sounded terrified. I found myself staring at the family photo on my kitchen counter, Emma, Lily, and me at last summer's camping trip, all of us grinning under a canopy of Douglas firs. How many times had I promised Emma I'd stay safe? How many times had I told Lily that Daddy always comes home? Please, Mrs. Davis continued, and I could hear her crying now. I know everyone else has given up, but you have a daughter too. I've seen her picture on your desk. If it were her. The woods were calling me back, returning to the Blackwood Trail, 11:47 m. The October air bit at my face as I parked my Ford F-150 at the Blackwood trailhead. My Ranger Station Motorola XPR 7550 crackled to life. Unit 23, this is base. Confirm you're 20. Base, this is Unit 23. GPS coordinates 47.8 DAO 21 degree N, 123.6044 degree W. Beginning follow-up investigation on Davis case. Static. Then, copy that, Luke. You sure about this? Case was closed months ago. I adjusted my duty belt. Streamlight flashlight, first aid kit, GPS unit, emergency beacon. The familiar weight should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like I was suiting up for war. Roger, base. Family received possible contact. Investigating. More static. 10-4. Check in every hour. Weather's calling for fog later. I shouldered my patrol pack and locked the truck. The trailhead sign looked exactly the same as it had in March. Blackwood Trail, 12 miles, moderate difficulty. But something felt different. Wrong. The morning light seemed dimmer, though no clouds blocked the sun. The familiar scent of pine and cedar carried an undertone I couldn't identify. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in water. My daughter Lily had drawn me a new picture the night before, pressing it into my hands before bedtime. Our family holding hands under a rainbow. I'd tucked it into my chest pocket, right next to my heart, same as I always did. Now it felt like armor. The first mile of trail was exactly as I remembered. Switchbacks through old-growth forest, fallen logs carpeted in moss, the distant sound of Copper Creek running over stones. I'd walked this path dozens of times during the original search, memorizing every route, every turn, every place where someone could step off the trail and disappear. Khloe had been last seen at mile marker 3.7, where the trail crossed an old wooden bridge over a ravine, Security footage from the trailhead showed her arriving at 6:23 a.m. on March 15th. A slight girl in hiking boots and a green windbreaker, camera bag slung over her shoulder, blonde ponytail bouncing as she walked. The next confirmed sighting was from a day hiker who passed her near the bridge around 8:15 a.m. She'd been photographing something in the trees, he said, smiling, happy. Then nothing. The bridge. 12:34 p.m. I reached the wooden bridge where Khloe was last seen, and my Garmin GPS confirmed the coordinates. 47.789 meters again, 123.5972 degree W. The planks creaked under my boots as they had 100 times before, but today each sound seemed amplified, echoing off the ravine walls below. I keyed my radio. Base Unit 23, at mile marker 3.7, beginning detailed sweep. Copy, Luke. Any signs? That's when I saw it. Carved into the bridge railing, fresh as if it had been made yesterday, were 3 words in shaky letters. Help me, Mama. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd inspected this bridge personally during the original investigation. Every inch. These words hadn't been there before. I pulled out my iPhone and photographed the carving, then took GPS coordinates. My hands were shaking, something that hadn't happened since my rookie days. Behind me, the forest had gone absolutely silent. No bird calls. No wind in the trees. Even Copper Creek seemed to be holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A woman's voice, distant and echoing, carrying up from the ravine below. Mama. Mama, please. The voice was thin and desperate, like someone calling through water. I grabbed the bridge railing and leaned over, peering down into the 40-foot drop. Nothing but shadows and fallen logs. But the voice came again, clearer now. I'm lost in the white dress. Someone's coming for me. Mrs. Davis's exact words. My radio crackled. Unit 23, base, you okay? You missed your check-in. I looked at my watch. 1:47 p.m. I'd been standing on this bridge for over an hour, though it felt like minutes. Base, this is Unit 23. I'm fine. Continuing investigation. Roger. Next check-in at 1500 hours. But I wasn't fine. The familiar weight of my gear felt wrong, like it belonged to someone else. The October air tasted metallic, and when I looked at the trees around the bridge, their shadows seemed to move independently of the wind. I had to go down into the ravine. Into the ravine. 2:15 p.m. The descent was treacherous. Loose rocks and rotting logs, everything slick with moss and morning dew. My boots slipped twice, and each time I caught myself, I thought of Emma's face when she made me promise to be careful. I thought of Lily's drawing pressed against my chest. At the bottom, Copper Creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The sound of moving water should have been peaceful, but down here in the shadows, it sounded like whispers. I followed the creek bed, checking every fallen log, every shadowed alcove where someone might have fallen. That's when I found Khloe's camera. The Canon EOS Rebel sat on a dry rock beside the creek, completely undamaged despite 4 months of Pacific Northwest weather. Impossible. I'd searched this exact spot 3 times during the original investigation. The camera hadn't been there. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The battery indicator showed full charge. Another impossibility. I pressed the playback button and scrolled through the photos. The first shots were normal. Sunrise through the trees, close-ups of moss and wildflowers, artistic compositions of light and shadow. Khloe had real talent. But as I scrolled forward, the images became disturbing, photo after photo of the same thing. A woman in a white dress standing at increasing distances in the forest. In the first photo, she was barely visible through the trees, just a pale shape that could have been a birch trunk or a patch of fog. But in each subsequent image, she moved closer to the camera. The woman's dress was old-fashioned, like something from a century ago, with long sleeves and a high collar. But even in the early photos, I could see dark stains across the white fabric, stains that looked suspiciously like blood. In the final photo, the woman stood directly in front of the camera, maybe 10 feet away. Her face was turned toward the ground, hidden by long dark hair. But her hands were reaching toward the lens. Her fingers were bone white and too long, and her nails looked black with old blood. The timestamp on the last photo read, 8:47 a.m., March 15th. 32 minutes after the day hiker saw Khloe taking pictures. My chest tightened. The air down in this ravine tasted wrong, sweet and rotten like funeral flowers. I needed to get back to the trail, back to my truck, back to the world of radios and procedures and things that made sense. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. The pursuit, 2:43 p.m. I spun around, hand instinctively moving to the pepper spray on my belt. The creek bed stretched empty behind me, nothing but stones and shadows, but I definitely heard footsteps, the soft splash of boots in shallow water. Splash, splash, splash. The sound came again, methodical and unhurried, like someone following my exact path. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Just my own boot prints in the muddy creek bank, and beside them were other prints. Bare feet, pale and narrow, with toenails that had pressed deep crescents into the mud. The prints appeared as I watched, filling with dark water that looked too much like blood. I backed away from the prints, stumbling over creek stones, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the water. The air was getting colder. Not the clean cold of October morning, but something deeper and deader, like the air in a morgue. "Base, this is Unit 23, I said into my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need backup at coordinates 47.7883 degree IN, 123.5968 degree Oz W." Nothing but static. "Base, do you copy? Unit 23 requesting immediate backup." Still nothing. I looked at my radio display, full signal strength, but the channel showed only static. My iPhone showed the same thing. Full bars, no service. The footsteps were getting closer. Splash, splash, splash. I scrambled up the ravine wall using tree roots and rock outcroppings, not caring about protocol or procedure anymore. I just needed to get back to the trail. Back to my truck. Back to a world where radios worked and cameras didn't photograph ghosts. But when I reached the bridge, I found something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Standing in the middle of the wooden planks was a woman in a white dress. The woman in white. 3:12 p.m. She stood perfectly still in the center of the bridge, facing away from me. Her dress was old-fashioned and stained with what looked like rust-colored blood. Dark hair hung down her back like a curtain, and her bare feet were pale against the weathered wood. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like concrete. The air around the bridge shimmered with cold, and I could see my breath despite the afternoon sun. "Khloe?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. The woman's head began to turn. Not like a living person turns their head. This was wrong, mechanical, like a door opening on rusted hinges. I caught a glimpse of pale skin, of dark hollows where eyes should be, and then she was facing me fully. It wasn't Khloe. The face was that of an older woman, maybe 40, with skin like parchment and lips that had once been red, but were now black with old blood. Her eyes were holes, not empty sockets, but voids that seemed to pull light into them and give nothing back. She opened her mouth and spoke in a voice like wind through dead leaves. She went into the white dress. "What?" I managed to croak. The woman raised one pale hand and pointed past me, toward a section of forest I'd never noticed before. Between two massive Douglas firs was what looked like a gap in the world, a space where the trees and shadows gave way to absolute white, like walking into fresh snow or television static. "She went into the white dress," the woman repeated. "They all go into the white dress eventually." Behind her, the bridge began to change. The wooden planks were turning white, bleaching like bones in the sun. The railings were becoming translucent, and through them I could see not the ravine below, but more whiteness, endless, empty white that hurt to look at. "Your daughter draws pretty pictures," the woman said, and my heart stopped. She knew about Lily. Somehow this thing knew about my daughter. I thought of Emma making breakfast this morning, humming as she packed Lily's lunch. I thought of Lily's gap-toothed grin when she gave me her drawing. I thought of all the promises I'd made to come home safe. "You can't have them," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "You can't have my family." The woman's mouth stretched wide, revealing teeth like broken glass. "I don't want your family, Ranger Patterson. I want you to bring me more." The white space behind her was growing, spreading like spilled milk across the forest floor. Trees disappeared into it. Rocks, the very ground itself. Soon there would be nothing left but white, and this creature, and me. "Bring me the lost ones," she whispered. "The ones who wander off the trail, the ones whose families call and beg. Bring them to the white dress, and your daughter will never have to draw another picture of Daddy not coming home." That's when I understood. This thing, whatever it was, fed on the lost. On people like Khloe Davis who wandered too far from the marked trail, and it wanted me to be its hunting dog, to lead victims into its white void in exchange for my family's safety. But I thought of Mrs. Davis's broken voice on the phone. I thought of all the families who'd made the same desperate calls, begging rangers not to give up. I thought of Lily's drawing pressed against my heart, our family holding hands under a rainbow. "No," I said. The woman's face twisted with rage. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and the bridge beneath my feet began to crack and splinter. The white void rushed toward me like a tsunami, and I could hear voices in it, screaming voices, calling for help, calling for their mothers. I turned and ran. The chase. 3:28 p.m. The forest had become a nightmare maze. Trails I'd hiked 100 times now led nowhere, doubling back on themselves or ending abruptly at walls of white static. The familiar landmarks were gone. The lightning-struck oak, the seasonal creek, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear. Everything was wrong, twisted, like the forest was folding in on itself. Behind me, I could hear the woman following. Not footsteps now, but something worse. The sound of fabric dragging across dead leaves, punctuated by her voice calling my name. "Luke. Luke Patterson. Bring me the lost ones." My radio crackled with static, but occasionally I caught fragments. "Unit 23, please respond." And Barn search team mobilizing. And once terrifyingly, my wife's voice. "Luke, where are you? Lily's asking when you're coming home." I ran harder, crashing through underbrush that cut at my face and hands. My duty belt bounced against my hip, and Lily's drawing crinkled against my chest with every step. I had to get out. I had to get home. I had to warn people about this thing that was wearing the forest like a mask. That's when I saw the light. Ahead, through the twisted trees, was a warm yellow glow that looked like sunlight. Real sunlight, not the cold white radiance that had been chasing me. I stumbled toward it, pushing through a curtain of low-hanging branches, and suddenly I was back on the main trail. My truck sat in the parking lot exactly where I'd left it, and my iPhone showed 17 missed calls from the station. From Emma, from Mrs. Davis. The time read 6:47 p.m. Somehow I'd been in the woods for over 7 hours, though it felt like minutes. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw her, the woman in white, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. Even from a distance, I could see her mouth moving, repeating the same words over and over. "Bring me the lost ones." The truth. 7:23. I drove straight to the ranger station and called Mrs. Davis. When she answered, her voice was thick with tears. "Did you find her?" she asked immediately. I stared at Khloe's camera, sitting on my desk, next to the incident report I'd been trying to write for the last 20 minutes. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I tell a grieving mother that her daughter hadn't just gotten lost? She'd been taken by something that wasn't supposed to exist. "Mrs. Davis," I said carefully. "I found Khloe's camera. But I need to ask you something important." The phone call you received last night, did you save it? Do you still have the recording? Silence. Then, there was no recording, Ranger Patterson. The call lasted 3 seconds, just long enough for her to say she was lost in the white dress, and then the line went dead. But you said, I know what I said. But when I called you this morning, there was no call on my phone log. No record of any call at 3:17 a.m. My daughter's number hasn't been active since March. My blood turned to ice water. Then why did you call me? Another long pause. When Mrs. Davis spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Because I dreamed about you, Ranger Patterson. I dreamed about a man in a uniform who could bring my daughter home. I dreamed about your badge number, Unit 23. I dreamed about your daughter's drawing that you carry in your chest pocket. I looked down at Lily's picture, still pressed against my heart. The dream felt so real, Mrs. Davis continued, like someone was showing it to me, like someone wanted us to meet. Do you understand what I'm saying? I understood perfectly. The thing in the forest, the woman in white, had used Mrs. Davis to lure me back. It had planted that dream, made her make that call, drawn me into its trap. It wanted me to become its hunter, to bring it more victims like Khloe. But there was something else. Something the creature didn't understand about men like me. Men with families to protect, with daughters who drew pictures of rainbows and trusted their fathers to come home. Mrs. Davis, I said, I'm going to find your daughter. But first, I need you to do something for me. I need you to call every family of every missing person in Olympic National Forest. Tell them to stay away from the Blackwood Trail. Tell them their loved ones aren't lost, they've been taken. And tell them that someone's going to bring them home. Mark of the return, October 31st, 11:59 p.m. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Luke Patterson's situation? Comment below. I returned to the Blackwood Trail on Halloween night, exactly 2 weeks after my first encounter with the woman in white. This time, I wasn't alone. Father Miguel Santos from St. Catherine's had been blessing hiking trails for 30 years, ever since his own brother disappeared in these woods. Dr. Sarah Chen was a folklore professor from University of Washington who specialized in Pacific Northwest legends. And Marcus Bear Thompson was a veteran ranger who'd seen things in these forests that didn't make it into official reports. We came armed not with weapons, but with knowledge. Dr. Chen had found the records, 17 missing hikers over the past 60 years, all from the Blackwood Trail. All young women, all described in witness reports as having been seen with a woman in an old white dress shortly before they vanished. The woman in white wasn't a ghost. She was something older, hungrier, a predator that had been feeding on the lost and forgotten for generations, using their voices to call for help, using their faces to lure in rescuers like me. But tonight was different. Tonight the families were with us, Mrs. Davis and 16 others, all holding pictures of daughters and sisters and friends who'd walked into the white and never walked out. Tonight, we were the hunters. The bridge looked exactly the same as it had 2 weeks ago, but the air felt different. Charged. Electric. The woman in white was waiting for us in the center of the span, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, pale and translucent in their hiking clothes, stood 17 young women. Khloe Davis was among them. You came back, the creature said, and her voice carried the echoes of all her victims. Did you bring me more lost ones? We brought their families, I said, stepping forward. We brought people who loved them, people who never stopped looking. That's when Mrs. Davis stepped past me onto the bridge. She was trembling, but her voice was strong. Khloe Marie Davis, you come home right now, your mother is here. The effect was immediate. Khloe's translucent form flickered, solidified, took a step toward her mother. The woman in white hissed like steam escaping from a kettle. Sarah Ann Mitchell, called another mother. Jennifer Walsh. Amanda Foster. One by one, the families called their daughters' names, and one by one, the victims began to remember who they were, began to fight against the white void that had claimed them. The creature's form began to waver. The white dress darkened, revealing the truth beneath. Not a woman at all, but something ancient and hungry, a void in the shape of loss and desperation. It had fed on forgotten victims for so long that it had forgotten what it was like to face love that refused to give up. They chose to come into the white, it shrieked. They chose to be lost. No, I said, pulling out Lily's drawing from my chest pocket. They chose to explore. They chose to live. You're the one who made them lost. But love always finds a way home. The bridge began to crack beneath our feet, but not with supernatural cold this time. With warmth. With the weight of 17 families who had never stopped believing, never stopped hoping, never stopped loving. The white void collapsed inward like a dying star, taking the creature with it. The missing hikers solidified fully, solid and alive and breathing, falling to their knees on the bridge as their families rushed to embrace them. Khloe Davis looked exactly as she had in her missing person photo, 22 years old, blonde ponytail, hiking boots. She fell into her mother's arms and sobbed like a child. "I'm sorry, Mama. I got lost. I got so lost." "I know, baby," Mrs. Davis whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. "But I found you. I never stopped looking." Epilogue. Home. 2:17 a.m. I made it home just as Emma was getting up to check on Lily for the third time that night. My wife took one look at my face and wrapped me in her arms without asking questions. "Rough call?" she whispered against my shoulder. "Found them all," I said, and it was the truth. All 17 of them. They're going home. Later, as I tucked Lily back into bed, she looked up at me with sleepy eyes. "Did you save people today, Daddy?" "Yeah, sweetheart, I did." "Good. That's what daddies do." She yawned and curled up under her rainbow comforter. "Will you always come home?" I thought about the woman in white, about the families who never gave up, about love that was stronger than any darkness the forest could hide. "Always," I promised. "Love always finds a way home." As I closed her bedroom door, I heard the October wind moving through the trees outside our house. But this time, it sounded like singing. 17 voices raised in harmony, finally free to find their way back to the light. The Blackwood Trail was closed indefinitely for geological instability, but sometimes hikers reported hearing something beautiful echoing from the old bridge, the sound of families calling their loved ones home, and the joyful voices that answered back. My name is Luke Patterson, and I learned something important in that haunted forest. The only thing stronger than the darkness that preys on the lost is the love that refuses to stop looking for them. Some monsters feed on despair, but hope, real hope backed by the fierce love of family, that's the one thing they can never swallow. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to the woman in white. I read every single one. My name is Tom Anderson, and I saw Brittany Lynn Hayes for the last time 3 meters in front of me on the trail, before she simply disappeared. Not walked away, not ran into the woods, not fell down a ravine. Disappeared. Like someone had hit the delete key on reality itself. It was October 15th, 2018, 2:47 p.m. according to my Garmin GPS, when my entire understanding of the natural world got ripped apart and fed back to me in bloody chunks. The temperature was a crisp 52 degrees Fahrenheit on the Cascade Trail in Olympic National Park, coordinates 47°42'15 N, 123°36, 42 GW, and I had been escorting Brittany on what should have been a routine documentary photography permit renewal hike. She was 24, blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a red North Face jacket that made her easy to spot against the autumn foliage. A freelance nature photographer from Seattle, she'd been coming to this section of the park for 3 months working on some project about forgotten places. Her press credentials were legitimate, her hiking experience solid, and her equipment professional grade. Everything was by the book. Except for the fucking wrongness I'd been feeling in my gut since we'd hit mile marker 3.2. 23 years as a ranger, and I've learned to trust that wrongness. It saved my ass more times than I can count, warned me about unstable rockfall, aggressive wildlife, flash flood conditions. My wife Sarah calls it my ranger spidey sense, and my 8-year-old daughter Emma thinks it's the coolest thing about her old man. That morning before my 6 a.m. shift started, Emma had wrapped her small arms around my neck and made me promise to use your superhero powers to stay safe, Daddy. Christ, if only she knew what her superhero daddy was about to face. The wrongness had started as a low-level buzz, like static electricity before a thunderstorm. By the time we reached the intersection of Cascade Trail and the old mining access road, a route that doesn't appear on any current park maps, it felt like someone was dragging fingernails across my spinal cord. "Mr. Anderson, is everything all right?" Brittany had asked, lowering her camera. "You look pale." I'd been gripping my radio so hard my knuckles were white. "Just checking weather conditions," I'd lied, releasing the talk button. The static that came back made my teeth ache. That's when I should have turned us around, when I should have listened to 23 years of experience screaming at me to get the hell out of there. Instead, I did what every horror movie character does. I ignored the warning signs and pressed forward. The mining road stretched ahead of us, overgrown with blackberry vines and devil's club, but still passable. Park records showed it had been abandoned in 1967, 1 year after what the old-timers still called the incident. I'd heard fragments of the story over the years. Some kind of industrial accident, several workers killed, the whole operation shut down overnight. The official reports were classified, buried so deep in bureaucratic bullshit that most people assumed it was just another mining company cutting corners on safety. But I'd seen the reports. 3 weeks ago, during a routine filing task, I discovered a water-damaged box of documents from 1966 in the basement of the ranger station. Most were illegible, but what I could make out painted a picture that had nothing to do with industrial accidents. Sounds of screaming from underground continued for 6 hours after the collapse. Survivor kept repeating, "It's not trapped. It's home now," before succumbing to injuries. Recommend immediate closure and concrete sealing of all access points. Phenomena inconsistent with known geological activity. I should have left that box in the basement, should have let the past stay buried. But something about those fragments had been eating at me, especially after Brittany had specifically requested access to this section of the park. When I'd asked why, she'd gotten evasive, muttering something about photographic documentation of industrial scars on wilderness. Now, walking behind her on that abandoned road, I realized she knew more than she was letting on. "The light is perfect here," she said, stopping to adjust her camera settings. "There's something about this place. It's like the atmosphere itself is different." She was right. The air tasted metallic, tinged with something that reminded me of burnt copper and meat left too long in the sun. The usual forest sounds, bird song, insect buzz, small mammals rustling through underbrush, had gone dead silent. Even the wind seemed muffled, like we were walking through invisible cotton. My radio crackled. "Unit 23, what's your 20? Grid 47123, Cascade Trail extension, escorting permit renewal," I responded, my voice sounding strange in the oppressive quiet. "Copy that, Tom. Weather Service is showing possible electrical activity in your area. Keep an eye on conditions." "Will do." But there were no clouds in the sky. The October sun should have been warming my face, but instead I felt chilled, like I was standing in the shadow of something massive and invisible. 3 meters ahead of me, Brittany suddenly stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, not turning around. I strained my ears. Nothing but that awful, pressure-filled silence. "Hear what?" "Singing, someone singing." The hair on my arm stood up. I moved closer to her, my hand instinctively dropping to the radio on my belt. "Brittany, I don't hear any." That's when it happened. 1 second she was there, solid and real, the red of her jacket bright against the green-brown forest palette. The next second, the air around her began to ripple, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, except the temperature had just dropped 20 degrees. "Brittany." She turned to look at me and her face was wrong. Not different. Wrong. Her features were exactly the same, but her expression held something ancient and hungry that had never belonged in human eyes. "Tom," she said, except her voice came from somewhere behind me. I spun around. Nothing there but empty trail. When I turned back, the space where Brittany had been standing was empty air. No footprints leading away. No disturbed vegetation. No sign she had ever existed. My legs gave out. I hit the dirt road hard, my knees scraping against gravel and broken asphalt. The impact jolted my training back online, and I grabbed my radio with shaking hands. Unit 23 to base. I have an emergency situation. Missing person, coordinates 47-4218N, 123-3639W. Immediate search and rescue response required. Static, then. Tom, did you say missing person? What's your situation? Brittany Hayes, 24-year-old female, red North Face jacket, disappeared from my visual contact approximately 30 seconds ago. No trace, no. My voice cracked. Base, something's not right here. I need backup immediately. Copy that, Unit 23. SR team is 20 minutes out. Maintain position and continue visual search of immediate area. 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, anything could happen to her. In 20 minutes, that wrongness in my gut could get her killed. I forced myself to stand up. My radio was picking up some kind of interference, a low, rhythmic sound that might have been chanting or growling. My GPS was showing my location as a solid blue dot, but the map overlay kept flickering, showing different topography than what my eyes were seeing. Brittany, I called out, my voice echoing off trees that seemed to absorb the sound. Brittany, if you can hear me, make noise. Follow my voice. From somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard what might have been a response, or might have been wind through hollow logs. The sound was human-shaped, but wrong, like someone trying to scream through a mouthful of dirt. I started moving toward it, every instinct I possessed screaming at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't. Emma's promise about superhero powers, Sarah's face when I'd kissed her goodbye that morning, the trust in Brittany's eyes when I'd assured her this was a safe, routine hike. All of it drove me forward into whatever nightmare was waiting in those trees. The old mining road curved ahead, and I could see where it ended at what looked like a concrete barrier, partially hidden by 40 years of vegetation growth. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a barrier. It was a seal. Someone had poured concrete into what had once been a mine entrance, but the seal was cracked, broken open like an eggshell from the inside. That metallic taste in the air got stronger, mixed now with the smell of sulfur and something else. Something organic and rotten that made my eyes water. My radio static was getting worse, the rhythmic sound underneath it more distinct. It was definitely chanting, in a language that hurt to listen to. Brittany, I called again, approaching the broken seal. This time I got an answer. Tom, help me. Her voice was coming from inside the mine. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Tom Anderson's situation? Comment below. I pulled out my Streamlight ProTac flashlight, the beam revealing a rough tunnel that descended at a sharp angle into absolute darkness. The concrete seal had been broken from the inside, leaving jagged edges that looked disturbingly like teeth. Fresh scratches in the concrete, no, not scratches, claw marks, led down into the tunnel. My phone showed no signal, but the timestamp read 3:03 p.m. 16 minutes had passed since Brittany disappeared, but it felt like hours. My hands were shaking as I called into the tunnel. Brittany, I'm coming, keep talking to me. Tom, please. It's so cold down here. Her voice was weaker now, echoing from somewhere deep underground. I should have waited for backup. Should have followed protocol. Should have done 100 things differently. Instead, I stepped into the mine. The temperature drop hit me like a physical blow. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the beam of my flashlight seemed to get swallowed by the darkness ahead. The tunnel walls were rough-hewn rock, but there were other things carved into the stone, symbols that made my vision blur when I looked at them directly. Brittany, keep talking. I'm following your voice. Tom, something's wrong with me. I can't feel my legs. Panic drove me deeper into the tunnel. My boots splashed through puddles of something that reflected my flashlight beam wrong, like it was thicker than water. The wrongness that had been gnawing at my gut all day was now a full-scale assault on my nervous system, making my vision tunnel and my heart race. The tunnel curved sharply to the right and suddenly opened into a vast underground chamber. My flashlight beam barely reached the far walls, but what it illuminated made me understand why this place had been sealed in 1967. The chamber was full of bones. Human bones, arranged in precise patterns that formed geometric shapes across the floor and up the walls. But these weren't ancient remains. Some still had flesh clinging to them, flesh that moved and twitched in the light of my flashlight. In the center of the chamber, suspended 3 feet off the ground by nothing I could see, was Brittany. Her red jacket was gone. Her skin had turned the color of old parchment, and her limbs were twisted at impossible angles, but she was still alive. Her chest still rose and fell, and her eyes tracked to me when my light hit her face. "Tom," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber despite the distance. "It's been waiting so long for someone like you." Someone like me? Someone who can feel it. Someone who can see what others can't. Her head tilted at an angle that should have broken her neck. "It's been trapped here since 1966, but it's getting stronger, feeding on the people who get too close, feeding on their fear, their pain, their life force." I stepped into the chamber and immediately regretted it. The geometric patterns of bones began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light, and the temperature plunged another 20 degrees. My radio went completely dead, the static replaced by a sound like 1,000 voices screaming underwater. "Brittany, I'm going to get you out of here." "No," she said, and smiled. Her teeth had turned black. "You're going to stay. It likes you, Tom. It likes your gifts. It wants to use them." That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a deeper shadow at the far end of the chamber. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the shadow had substance, had form. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall, and vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every way that mattered. Its limbs were too long, jointed in too many places. Its head was a writhing mass of tentacles or hair or something worse. And its eyes were the exact same shade of blue as Brittany's. "Welcome, Thomas Anderson," it said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I have been waiting for you." The smell of sulfur and decay was overwhelming now, making me gag. My flashlight flickered, and in the moment of darkness I felt something brush against my mind, something vast and alien and hungry. 52 years, it continued. 52 years trapped in this pathetic hole, surviving on scraps, hikers who wandered too far off the trail, rangers who investigated reports of missing persons. A few dozen lives stretched out over 5 decades. I forced myself to speak. "What are you?" "I am what your kind summoned in 1966. Your mining operation broke through the barriers between worlds, and I slipped through. But the closing of the portal trapped me here, limited my power, forced me to hide like a parasite in the darkness." The bones on the chamber floor began to move, reassembling themselves into new configurations. I realized they weren't random. They were forming a circle around me. "But you, Thomas, you have the sight. You can feel the supernatural world bleeding through into yours. And with your abilities as a conduit, I can finally break free of this prison." My training kicked in. In an emergency, assess the situation, prioritize objectives, take action. Objective 1, rescue Brittany. Objective 2, survive. Objective 3, prevent this thing from escaping. I pulled out my backup radio, an older analog model that sometimes worked when digital failed. It crackled to life. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Unit 23, coordinates 47 to 4218 N, 123 to 3639 W. I have located missing person Brittany Hayes in underground chamber beneath old mining seal. Require immediate extraction and..." I paused, knowing how insane this would sound. "Be advised, we have a hostile entity situation. Do not approach without full SR support." The thing that called itself a demon laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming children. They cannot hear you, Thomas. This place exists partially outside your reality now. Time moves differently here. Space bends according to my will. It gestured to Brittany's suspended form. Your friend has been my guest for what feels like days to her. Though only minutes have passed in your world, I looked at Brittany again, really looked at her and saw that her fingernails were bloody, worn down to nothing. Her clothes were shredded and there were bite marks along her arms, bite marks that matched her own teeth. What did you do to her? I am teaching her to hunger as I hunger, to feed as I feed. She will be my first apostle when I break free of this place. And you, with your gifts, will be my doorway back to the world above. The bone circle around me was complete now, glowing brighter with that sick phosphorescent light. I could feel something pulling at the edges of my consciousness, trying to burrow its way into my mind. I can feel your fear, Thomas. Your guilt over failing to protect her. Your terror at the thought of never seeing your wife Sarah again, never hearing your daughter Emma laugh again. That fear is delicious, but it's not what I need from you. Emma, Sarah. The thought of this thing loose in the world, hunting people like my family, gave me the strength to resist its mental intrusion. What do you need from me? I asked, buying time while I looked for a way out of the bone circle. Your psychic sensitivity makes you a perfect anchor point. Through you, I can extend my influence beyond this chamber, beyond this forest. I can reach into your world and begin preparing it for my arrival. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief darkness I saw something that made my blood freeze. The walls of the chamber weren't just covered in bones. They were covered in carved names, dozens of them. All the missing persons reports from the past 50 years. People who had vanished without a trace in Olympic National Park. And there, carved fresh into the rock near Brittany's position, was a new name. Emma Anderson. No, I whispered. Oh yes, the demon purred. I've been watching you, Thomas. Learning about your family through your dreams, your fears. Your daughter will make an excellent host once I'm free. Children are so malleable. Rage flooded through me, burning away the fear and confusion. I've faced down charging bears, avalanches, wildfire walls, and every other natural disaster the wilderness could throw at me. But this thing threatening my daughter? That was a mistake. I grabbed the emergency flare from my belt and cracked it, filling the chamber with brilliant red light. The demon shrieked and recoiled, its form becoming less substantial in the harsh illumination. Light! Brittany's voice was suddenly clear, human. Tom, it can't maintain its hold in direct light. I had 6 flares total, at 3 minutes burn time each. That gave me 18 minutes to figure out how to kill something that had been alive since 1966. The demon's form wavered in the flare light, but it didn't retreat completely. Instead, it began to change, its shadowy mass condensing into something more physically solid, more dangerous. Clever, it hissed. But light alone won't destroy me. And when your flares burn out, I'll still be here. I'll always be here. Its new form was nightmare fuel, part human, part insect, part something that had never existed in any natural ecosystem. Multiple arms ending in razor-sharp claws, a mouth full of teeth like broken glass, and those 2 blue eyes that held 50 years of accumulated hatred. But it was solid now, physical, and physical things could be hurt. I dropped the flare and pulled out my backup sidearm, a Glock 17 I'd carried for 15 years and never fired outside of firing range. The demon laughed as I aimed it at center mass. Bullets cannot harm me, fool. I am beyond your... I put 3 rounds into its chest. The demon stumbled backward, black ichor spraying from the wounds. It looked down at itself in what might have been surprise. Impossible. Yeah, well, you picked the wrong ranger to fuck with. I kept the gun trained on it while reaching for another flare with my free hand. See, I've been carrying blessed ammunition for the past 3 weeks, ever since I found those documents about the 1966 incident. That wasn't entirely true. I'd had Father Mackenzie at St. Joseph's bless my bullets after reading those water-damaged reports, more out of superstition than any real belief. But the demon didn't need to know that. "You cannot kill me with such simple protections," it snarled, but there was uncertainty in its voice now. "Maybe not," I agreed, backing toward where Brittany hung suspended, "but I can sure as hell slow you down." I cracked the second flare and tossed it toward the chamber entrance, cutting off the demon's escape route. The red light revealed more details I wished I couldn't see. The walls weren't just carved with names and symbols. They were covered in a thick organic substance that pulsed like a heartbeat. This entire chamber was alive, some kind of massive organism that had been growing here for 50 years. "Brittany," I called, not taking my eyes off the demon. "Can you move?" I think so. Whatever was holding me let go when you lit the flares." She dropped to the ground, landing hard but rolling to absorb the impact. Her photographer's instincts were still intact, even after whatever torture she'd endured. But when she stood up, I could see the changes the demon had made to her body. Her fingernails had grown into claws, her canine teeth were longer and sharper, and her eyes held flecks of the same unnatural blue as the demon's. "Tom, we have to get out of here. It's not just one entity, it's some kind of collective. There are dozens of them down here, maybe hundreds. They've been using the missing people as hosts, as breeding stock." The demon was recovering from the gunshots, the wounds already beginning to close. But the blessed bullets had done more damage than ordinary rounds would have. The ichor leaking from its chest was steaming in the flare light, eating away at its own flesh like acid. "The tunnel," I said, grabbing Brittany's arm and pulling her toward the chamber entrance. "We need to reach the surface and seal this place permanently." But as we approached the tunnel opening, our path was blocked by two more demons, smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. These looked like they might once have been human, but their transformation was nearly complete. I recognized one of them from missing person photos I'd seen over the years. Jake Morrison, a hiker who'd vanished in 2014. "Tom Anderson," Jake Thing said, its voice a grotesque parody of human speech. "You cannot leave. You belong to us now." I had 3 flares left and maybe 10 rounds in the Glock, not nearly enough to fight our way through an army of possessed humans and demons. That's when I noticed something about the chamber's construction. The organic growth on the walls was thickest around certain areas that corresponded to structural weak points in the rock. This place wasn't just a natural cave that had been expanded by mining operations. It was deliberately designed to be destroyed if necessary. The 1966 workers hadn't just tried to seal the entrance. They'd rigged the entire chamber to collapse. "Brittany," I whispered, "when I say run, you head for that tunnel as fast as you can. Don't look back, don't stop for anything." "What about you?" I pulled the last 3 flares from my belt and held them like grenades. "I'm going to finish what they started in 1966. The main demon had recovered enough to advance on us again. Its wounds hissed and bubbled, but no longer bleeding freely. Behind it, I could see more shapes moving in the darkness. The army of possessed humans and lesser demons that Brittany had warned me about. "You think your pathetic light sticks can bring down a chamber that has stood for millions of years?" the demon taunted. "Not the light," I said, cracking all 3 flares simultaneously. "The heat." I hurled the flares at the thickest concentrations of organic growth on the walls, the ones covering what looked like old mining charges that had never been detonated. The blazing red light revealed the truth of what I'd suspected. This chamber was a carefully constructed trap, designed to be triggered if the entities it contained ever became too dangerous. The organic matter began to smoke and burn where the flares hit it, and I could hear a sound like screaming coming from the walls themselves. But more importantly, I could hear a faint ticking sound, like an old-fashioned timer counting down. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Brittany and shoving her toward the tunnel entrance. We made it maybe 20 yards up the tunnel before the charges went off. The explosion wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, tearing holes in reality itself. The tunnel filled with a wind that came from no earthly source, carrying sounds and smells from places that didn't exist on any map. Behind us, I could hear the demon's final scream as tons of rock and earth buried it alive for the second time in 50 years. But this time, there would be no breaking free. We stumbled out of the mine entrance just as the SAR team arrived, emerging into late afternoon sunlight that felt like salvation itself. My radio crackled back to life. cutting through the supernatural interference that had been blocking communications. Unit 23, this is base. We show multiple seismic events at your location. What's your status? I looked at Brittany, who was already pulling out her camera and documenting the collapsed mine entrance. The changes I'd seen in her were fading, her fingernails returning to normal length, her teeth losing their predatory sharpness, but her eyes still held those blue flecks, and I suspected they always would. Base, this is Unit 23. Missing person located and recovered. Area is now geologically unstable. Recommend permanent closure and hazard marking. Copy that, Tom. Medical is en route for you and the victim. Victim, if they only knew. Over the next few hours, as EMTs checked us over and investigators took our statements, Brittany and I came up with a story that wouldn't get us committed to psychiatric evaluation. Unstable ground conditions. A partial cave-in that temporarily trapped her. Disorientation and mild hypothermia that explained any inconsistencies in our accounts. The official report blamed the missing persons from the past 50 years on natural hazards and wildlife predation. The mine entrance was sealed with concrete and steel, marked with warnings that would hopefully keep future visitors away. And the case was closed. But I knew better. I knew what was really buried under all that rock and earth, and I knew that somewhere in the darkness something was still screaming. 3 months later, I put in for a transfer to a different park, somewhere far from Olympic National Forest, somewhere without abandoned mines or missing person reports that stretched back decades. Sarah understood. She'd seen the changes in me, the way I woke up screaming from nightmares I couldn't remember, the way I obsessively checked locks and windows before bed. Emma just knew that Daddy's superhero powers had saved someone, and that was enough for her. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and my family is asleep, I can still feel that wrongness gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, and I wonder if what we buried in that mine shaft was really dead, or just waiting for someone else with the sight to come looking for answers. Brittany kept in touch for a while. Her photographs from that day were published in National Geographic, launching her career as a documentary photographer specializing in industrial scars on wilderness environments. She never mentioned what we'd really experienced in that chamber, but I could see it in her work. Shadows that fell in impossible directions, organic textures that looked uncomfortably like living flesh, landscapes that seemed to be watching the viewer. Last I heard, she was investigating reports of missing hikers near an abandoned mining operation in Colorado. I hope she's more careful this time. I hope she remembers what we learned about the things that hide in dark places, feeding on fear and pain in human life. I hope she remembers that some doors should never be opened, and some seals should never be broken. But mostly, I hope that what we buried in Olympic National Forest stays buried. Because if it doesn't, if it finds a way to break free again, there might not be another Thomas Anderson around to stop it. My name is Tom Anderson, and I saw things in that forest that no ranger training could have prepared me for. I faced down a demon from 1966, saved a life, and helped prevent something unspeakable from escaping into our world. But every night when I close my eyes, I can still hear its voice promising that our paths will cross again. And deep down, I know it's probably right. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Brittany Hayes down in that mine. I read every single one. My name is Hunter Carlisle, and I should have forgotten the case of Jessica Martinez, but something brought me back to that cursed forest. It was October 15th, 2018, and I'd been avoiding the Black Ridge National Forest for 3 months. 3 months since Jessica Martinez, 23 years old with dreams of becoming a wildlife photographer, had simply vanished from Trail 47 like smoke in the wind. The official search had lasted 2 weeks. The unofficial one in my head had never stopped. I was still new to Colorado, transferred from the flat pine forests of East Texas just 8 months prior. Everything about Black Ridge felt wrong to me. The way shadows fell at impossible angles, how the elevation made my ears pop and my head throb. The local rangers whispered warnings about problem areas they never fully explained. Back in Texas, missing hikers usually meant broken ankles or getting turned around. Here, People just disappeared. My radio crackled to life at 7:23 a.m., cutting through my coffee and the morning reports I'd been avoiding. Unit 23, respond to coordinate 39.74, 1 again, 105.9294 DW, possible evidence in the Martinez case. My stomach dropped. The metallic taste of instant coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Unit 23, copy. What kind of evidence? Hunter, it's Sergeant Mills. Hiker found Jessica's camera gear about a quarter-mile off Trail 47. It's intact. Too intact for being out there 3 months. I set down my coffee cup, watching my hand shake slightly. The morning sun streaming through the ranger station windows suddenly felt cold. Her camera? That's impossible. We grid searched that entire area. I know. That's why you need to get out there. And Hunter? Mills's voice dropped. Be careful. That area, there have been stories. Stories. There were always stories in mountain communities, folklore passed down like DNA. But Mills was a 30-year veteran who'd seen everything from bear maulings to avalanche rescues. When he mentioned stories, my chest tightened with something I couldn't name. I gathered my gear with the muscle memory of a routine that had become ritual. Motorola radio clipped to my shoulder, GPS unit showing full battery, first aid kit, emergency shelter, protein bars that tasted like cardboard but kept you alive. My boots felt heavier than usual as I laced them, the familiar weight of my uniform suddenly foreign against my skin. The drive to Trail 47 took 23 minutes, winding through aspen groves that should have been peak golden but looked strangely muted, like someone had drained half the color from the world. October in Colorado was supposed to be breathtaking. Instead, the landscape felt like it was holding its breath. I parked at the same spot where Jessica's Honda Civic had sat for 5 days before her roommate reported her missing. The trailhead looked innocent enough. Standard Forest Service sign, worn wooden posts, the kind of hiking trail featured in tourism brochures. But as I shouldered my pack, the weight of 3 months' worth of nightmares settled between my shoulder blades. The coordinates led me down a path I'd walked dozens of times during the original search. Every footstep echoed my previous failures. Here was where we'd found her water bottle, empty but clean. There was the granite outcropping where her hiking poles had been neatly stacked, as if she'd stopped for a planned rest. None of it had made sense then. It made even less sense now. After 47 minutes of hiking, my GPS beeped. The location was just ahead, through a stand of lodgepole pines that seemed to lean inward, creating shadows even in broad daylight. And there, sitting on a fallen log like it had been placed there moments before, was Jessica's camera bag. My heart hammered against my ribs. The black Loe Pro bag looked pristine, no weather damage, no animal tears, no 3 months of mountain exposure. I approached slowly, each step deliberate, my ranger training warring with an instinct that screamed at me to turn around. The bag was exactly where Jessica had described it in her final Instagram post. Perfect spot for some sunrise shots tomorrow. This forest has such mysterious energy. Wildlife photography. Colorado, our adventure. She'd posted it at 6:47 p.m. on July 18th. She was reported missing on July 23rd. I knelt beside the bag, pulling on latex gloves with hands that had developed a slight tremor. The zippers worked smoothly, too smoothly. Inside, her Canon 5D Mark IV sat nestled in foam padding, looking like it had just left the camera shop. But when I checked the memory card, my blood turned to ice water. The last photo was timestamped 11:43 p.m., July 22nd. Impossible. Jessica was an experienced photographer, but she wouldn't have been shooting at midnight in unfamiliar terrain. The image showed the forest at night, but something was wrong with the lighting. Instead of the harsh glare of a camera flash, everything was illuminated by a soft, unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. And in the background, just visible between 2 pine trunks, was a figure. I zoomed in on the camera's LCD screen, squinting at the pixelated form. It looked like a person, but the proportions were off. Too tall, too thin, with arms that seemed to hang below where they should end. And the clothes, ragged, layered like someone who'd been living rough for months or years. A homeless person. out here miles from the nearest town. My radio crackled. Unit 23, status report. I keyed the mic with a thumb that had gone numb. Found the camera bag. It's... Mills, this doesn't make sense. The equipment looks brand new and there are photos dated after Jessica went missing. Static. Then, Hunter, get out of there, now. What? Why? I need to process the scene, collect evidence. Hunter, listen to me very carefully. Mills's voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, something between fear and resignation. There are things about that area we should have told you, things the locals know but don't talk about to outsiders. Get back to your truck and we'll discuss it at the station. But before I could respond, I heard it. Crying. Soft, desperate sobbing coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. Human crying. Someone in distress. Every ranger instinct I possessed screamed at me to respond. This was why I'd become a ranger. To help people in trouble. To be the difference between life and death in the wilderness. The sound pulled at something deep in my chest. The same feeling that had made me run toward danger instead of away from it my entire adult life. Mills, I'm hearing someone crying. Female voice, approximately 200 yards northwest of my position. Possible survivor situation. Hunter, no. Do not investigate, return to base immediately, that's a direct order. But the crying continued, heartbroken and desperate, and something in it sounded familiar. Like a voice I'd heard in family interview recordings, in desperate phone calls to the ranger station, in the dreams that had been haunting me for 3 months. It sounded like Jessica Martinez. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Hunter Carlisle's situation? Comment below. I switched off my radio. The crying led me deeper into the forest, past areas that should have been familiar but looked subtly wrong. Trees seemed closer together, shadows fell at angles that defied the sun's position, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees despite the clear October sky. My breath began to fog, and each exhale felt like I was surrendering pieces of my soul to the mountain air. The sound stayed consistently ahead of me, always just out of sight, leading me through terrain that became increasingly difficult. Fallen logs blocked obvious paths, forcing detours that led away from my GPS coordinates. Rocky outcroppings appeared where my topographical map showed clear hiking trails. It was as if the forest itself was rearranging to guide my steps. After what felt like hours but registered as only 27 minutes on my watch, I emerged into a small clearing I'd never seen before. And there, sitting on a stump in the center of the space, was a man. He looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone living rough in the mountains. Layers of dirty clothing, unkempt beard, hollow cheeks that spoke of inconsistent meals. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and when he looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, every compassionate instinct I possessed flooded to the surface. "Oh, thank God," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "I've been lost for days. I can't find my way out. Please, I just need some food, some water, I'm so hungry." This was it. This was why I'd become a ranger. Not for the routine patrol duties or the paperwork, but for moments like this where I could be the difference between someone living or dying in the wilderness. I approached slowly, hands visible, using the calm voice I'd practiced for emergency situations. "Hey there, I'm Hunter, I'm a forest ranger, you're safe now, let me help you." I unslung my pack and pulled out one of my emergency energy bars and my backup water bottle. The man's eyes followed my movements with an intensity that made my skin crawl, but I pushed the feeling aside. Homeless individuals often displayed heightened alertness. It was a survival mechanism. "What's your name?" I asked, settling into a crouch about 6 feet away, close enough to help but far enough to maintain safe distance. "How long have you been out here?" "Name's Eddie," he said, accepting the water bottle with hands that shook convincingly. "Been out here? God, what day is it? I lose track. Been wandering in circles for weeks. Keep seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices." He drank deeply, and I noticed his Adam's apple didn't bob with the swallowing motion. Something about that detail lodged in my brain like a splinter. but I couldn't place why it bothered me. "Eddie, I'm going to get you out of here, okay? But first, I need to ask you something important. Have you seen a young woman out here? 23 years old, Hispanic, about 5'6". She went missing 3 months ago." His eyes lit up with what looked like genuine recognition. "Jessica? Yes, oh God, yes. Beautiful girl, had that big camera. She helped me, gave me food. Sweet kid, talked about her family constantly. Her little sister's quinceañera, her mother's restaurant in Denver." My heart rate spiked. Those details weren't in any public reports. Jessica's sister Maria had indeed been planning her quinceañera, and their mother Rosa did run a small Mexican restaurant in northwest Denver. Information that only someone who'd actually talked to Jessica would know. "Where is she, Eddie? Is she okay?" His face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine anguish. "I don't know. She was helping me, bringing me food every day, but then she just stopped coming. That was weeks ago. I've been looking for her, calling for her. That's why I've been crying. I'm so worried about that sweet girl." Everything about his story made sense. Jessica would absolutely help someone in need, would absolutely share personal family details with someone she was trying to help. It explained why she'd stayed in the area longer than planned, why she'd been taking photos at unusual times. She'd been documenting her interactions with Eddie, maybe planning a story about wilderness survival or homelessness. "Eddie, I need you to show me where you last saw Jessica. Can you do that?" He nodded eagerly, struggling to his feet with the practiced difficulty of someone whose body had been pushed to its limits. Yes, I can show you. She had a little camp set up not far from here. Hidden spot, real private, smart girl, knew how to stay safe." But as he stood, several things happened simultaneously that made my ranger instincts scream warnings I should have heeded. First, despite claiming to be starving and weak, Eddie moved with a fluid strength that contradicted his apparent frailty. Second, the temperature in the clearing dropped another 10 degrees in the space of seconds, and my breath began fogging so heavily I could barely see. Third, every bird sound in the forest stopped at once, creating a silence so complete it made my ears ring. And fourth, I realized that in all his grateful rambling about Jessica helping him, Eddie had never once asked her last name, but he'd responded immediately when I'd said Jessica, as if he'd been expecting me to mention her specifically, as if this entire encounter had been orchestrated. "The camp's this way," Eddie said, already walking toward a gap between two massive pines that I could have sworn hadn't been there moments before. "Jessica will be so happy to see you. She's been waiting for you, Hunter." He knew my name. I'd introduced myself, but the way he said it now carried weight, familiarity, like he'd been expecting Hunter Carlyle specifically. My hand moved instinctively toward my radio, but Eddie was already 20 feet away, moving through the trees with impossible speed for someone who'd claimed to be weak and disoriented. If I lost sight of him, I might lose the only lead I'd had in Jessica's case for 3 months. Against every survival instinct screaming in my head, I followed him into the trees. The path Eddie led me down didn't exist on any map. I knew because I'd memorized every trail in this section during the original search, had walked every documented route multiple times. This trail wound through terrain that seemed to shift around us. Fallen logs that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Rock formations that appeared and disappeared like mirages. Eddie maintained his lead of exactly 20 feet, never closer, never farther, moving with a consistent speed that required me to push myself just to keep up. For someone who'd been starving in the wilderness for weeks, his endurance was remarkable. Impossible, actually. "Eddie, slow down a bit," I called, my breath coming harder as the elevation continued to climb. "How much farther?" "Not far now," he called back without turning around. "Jessica's waiting. She's been waiting so long, Hunter. She knew you'd come back for her." There it was again. The specific knowledge, the expectation, and something else. When he said Jessica's name, his voice carried a tone that made my skin crawl. Not concern or worry, but something that sounded almost hungry. My watch showed we'd been hiking for 43 minutes, but the sun's position suggested it should be late afternoon instead of midday. Time was behaving strangely, flowing like thick honey, and I realized I had no clear idea how to get back to where I'd started. Then I smelled it. The metallic scent of old copper pennies mixed with something organic and wrong. The smell grew stronger as we approached what looked like a natural shelter formed by fallen trees and overgrown with decades of pine needles and forest debris. "Here we are," Eddie said, stopping for the first time since we'd started walking. Jessica's special place, but as I got closer, I could see that the shelter wasn't natural. The logs had been arranged deliberately, stacked and interwoven to create walls and a roof. And scattered around the entrance were personal items that made my heart stop. A pink hiking boot, a University of Colorado sweatshirt, a small silver cross on a broken chain that I recognized from Jessica's missing person photos. "Eddie," I said slowly, my hand moving toward the pepper spray on my belt. "What is this place?" He turned around for the first time since we'd started walking, and when he smiled, I saw that his teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too many, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. "This is where I keep my new friends," he said, and his voice had changed. Deeper, resonant with harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere inside the earth itself. Jessica was so kind to me, Hunter. So generous. She gave me everything she had. The rational part of my mind tried to process what I was seeing. Homeless man, possibly suffering from mental illness, potentially dangerous. Proceed with caution, call for backup, follow protocol. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that had kept humans alive for millennia before we invented protocols, was screaming one word over and over. Run. "Where is Jessica now, Eddie?" His smile widened impossibly, stretching his face in ways that human facial muscles shouldn't allow. "Oh, she's very close. Would you like to see her?" Before I could answer, I heard it. Scratching, coming from inside the shelter. Desperate, rhythmic scratching like fingernails on wood, accompanied by a sound that might have been muffled crying. Someone was inside that shelter. Someone was still alive. "Jessica," I called out, taking a step toward the structure. The scratching stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded unmistakably like someone trying to scream through a gag. I'd found her. 3 months later, against impossible odds, I'd actually found Jessica Martinez alive. Every thought of danger, every screaming instinct to flee was overwhelmed by the surge of purpose that had defined my entire career. This was why I'd become a ranger. This was the moment that justified every difficult day, every dangerous rescue, every night lying awake worrying about people who might be depending on me. I rushed toward the shelter entrance. Eddie's hand closed around my wrist with strength that felt like a steel cable tightening. His grip was cold, far colder than any human hand should be. And when I looked down at where he touched me, my skin began to turn gray. "Now, Hunter," he said in that impossible voice, "before you meet Jessica, we need to discuss what you're going to give me in return for all my help." I looked up into his face, and what I saw there wasn't human. The features were still recognizably Eddie's, but behind his eyes was something vast and hungry and utterly alien. Something that had been waiting in this forest far longer than 3 months. Something that fed on the kindness of people who stopped to help strangers in distress. The scratching from inside the shelter resumed, more frantic now, and I realized with crystalline clarity that whatever was making that sound, it wasn't Jessica Martinez. It was bait. And I was the next course. I tried to pull away from Eddie's grip, but his fingers had somehow grown around my wrist like roots, penetrating my skin with tendrils I could feel moving beneath my flesh. The gray discoloration was spreading up my arm, and with it came a numbing cold that felt like liquid nitrogen in my veins. "Don't fight it, Hunter." Eddie's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once now, reverberating through the trees themselves. Fighting only makes the process more uncomfortable. Jessica learned that. "What did you do to her?" I managed to ask through gritted teeth, using my free hand to grab the pepper spray from my belt. Eddie laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "I gave her exactly what she wanted, the chance to help someone forever. She's been so useful, calling out to bring others like you to visit. Would you like to see how helpful she's become?" The scratching stopped and something emerged from the shelter. It had Jessica's hair, Jessica's build, Jessica's clothes. But the thing that crawled out on hands and knees moved wrong, like a marionette operated by someone who'd never seen a human walk. Its head turned toward me with mechanical precision, and when it opened its mouth, Jessica's voice came out. "Hunter," it said with perfect inflection, perfect emotional resonance. "I've been waiting for you. Please don't leave me here. Please help me." But Jessica's eyes were gone. In their place were hollow sockets that seemed to contain swirling darkness, and when the thing that wore her face smiled, I saw the same, too sharp teeth that Eddie had shown me. I discharged the pepper spray directly into Eddie's face. It had no effect whatsoever. He didn't even blink. "Oh, Hunter," he said, with what sounded like genuine disappointment. "That wasn't very nice. And after I've been so helpful, showing you exactly where Jessica ended up." The gray infection had reached my shoulder now, and I could feel my arm going completely numb. But worse than the physical sensation was the mental fog that came with it, a creeping confusion that made it hard to remember why I'd come here, why I'd ever cared about some missing girl, why anything mattered at all. "Let me explain how this works," Eddie continued conversationally, as if we were discussing weekend plans instead of my impending death. "You see, I've been in this forest for a very long time, decades actually, and I've learned that the best way to catch prey isn't to hunt them." The Jessica thing crawled closer, moving with that horrible puppet-like gait still speaking in her voice. "It's to let them hunt themselves, Hunter. People are so eager to help, so desperate to be heroes. All you have to do is give them something to save. People like you," Eddie said, "always come looking for people like Jessica, compassionate souls who can't resist helping strangers. And when you find those strangers, your empathy makes you vulnerable, makes you easy to catch." The numbness had reached my neck, and I realized with growing horror that I was losing the ability to move my legs. In minutes, maybe less, I'd be completely paralyzed. But my mind was still working, still processing the implications of what Eddie was telling me. "How many?" I asked. "How many what? How many people have you caught this way?" Eddie's smile became almost fond. "Oh, Hunter, so many. Hikers looking for their missing friends, rangers like you, investigating disappearances, search and rescue volunteers, even some FBI agents when cases got big enough. They all had one thing in common." "What?" "They couldn't resist helping someone who appeared to be in need." The paralysis reached my torso, and I began to sag against Eddie's grip, but he held me upright effortlessly, his inhuman strength supporting my full weight with casual ease. "The beautiful thing," he continued, "is that each person I catch becomes a lure for the next. Jessica calls out for other hikers. You'll call out for other rangers, and so on and so on. A perpetual feast all powered by human compassion." Through the fog of demonic paralysis creeping through my mind, one thought remained crystal clear. My family, my wife Sarah, making coffee in our kitchen this morning, kissing me goodbye with lips that tasted like vanilla creamer. My daughter Emma, 8 years old, who still believed her daddy could fix anything, protect anyone, come home from every dangerous situation because he was smart and strong and careful. They were expecting me home tonight. Sarah had made my favorite dinner, pot roast with those little potatoes Emma loved to steal from my plate. We had plans to watch a movie together, something animated and cheerful that would make Emma laugh and fall asleep between us on the couch. If I didn't make it home, Sarah would call the station. Mills would organize a search. Other rangers would come looking for me, and they'd find the same signs I'd found. Equipment too well preserved, evidence that led deeper into the forest, crying voices calling for help. And they'd follow those voices because that's what rangers do. Eddie's feeding cycle would continue, powered by the dedication and compassion of people who'd sworn to protect others. My death wouldn't just be my death. It would be the beginning of deaths for every person who came looking for me. "I can see you're thinking about your family," Eddie said, somehow reading my thoughts. "Sarah and Emma, isn't it? Don't worry. When they send people to look for you, I'll take very good care of them too." The mention of my family's names in that impossibly hungry voice ignited something inside me that the demonic paralysis couldn't touch. Not strength. I had no physical strength left, but clarity, purpose, the absolute, unshakable certainty that whatever happened to me, I would not let this thing use my death to hurt other people. With the last functioning muscles in my body, I managed to reach my emergency GPS beacon and activate it. The device immediately began transmitting my exact coordinates to the search and rescue center in Denver, along with an automated distress signal that would bring helicopters, rescue teams, and federal agents if necessary. More importantly, it would bring them to this exact spot where they'd find evidence of Eddie's operation. Eddie felt me activate the device and hissed with genuine anger. Clever Ranger. But it won't matter. When your rescue team arrives, they'll find only a homeless man who tried desperately to help a lost forest ranger. I'll be weak and terrified and grateful for their assistance, and they'll be so concerned with helping me that they won't notice how cold my hands are until it's far too late. The paralysis reached my brain and my vision began to tunnel, but as consciousness faded, I used the last of my awareness to do something Eddie wouldn't expect from a dying man. I smiled, because Eddie had made one crucial mistake in his centuries of hunting compassionate humans. He'd assumed that people like me, people who dedicated their lives to helping others, were motivated purely by emotion, by knee-jerk empathy that could be easily exploited. He'd never considered that the best rescuers are also the most methodical. Before following Eddie into the woods, I'd done something that had become automatic after 8 months of working in an unfamiliar forest where people regularly disappeared. I'd updated my GPS log with detailed notes about everything I'd encountered: Eddie's appearance, his claims about Jessica, the exact coordinates where I'd found her camera, and most importantly, a clear description of the psychological manipulation tactics Eddie had used to lead me away from safety. When the rescue team found my GPS beacon, they wouldn't just find my location. They'd find a complete tactical assessment of Eddie's methods, written by someone who'd survived long enough to understand exactly how the predator operated. They'd be prepared. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was Eddie's confident smile faltering as he realized what I'd done. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely worried. And somewhere in the distance, I could already hear the sound of helicopters. I woke up 3 days later in Denver General Hospital, with Sarah holding my left hand and Emma asleep in a chair beside my bed. The doctors said I'd been found in severe hypothermic shock with signs of what appeared to be advanced frostbite. Despite the October weather being mild, they couldn't explain the gray discoloration that had covered most of my body, or why it had faded completely within hours of my rescue. They also couldn't explain how I'd survived 3 days of exposure with no food or water. But I knew. And more importantly, I knew that Eddie hadn't survived. Mills visited me on the 4th day, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Hunter, we need to talk about what happened out there. Did you find him?" Mills nodded grimly. "We found someone, male, approximately 50 years old, living rough, but Hunter, he was dead when we got there. Had been for what the coroner estimates was several months. Severe malnutrition, exposure, probably died sometime in early summer." I stared at the ceiling, processing this information. And the shelter? Jessica's belongings? We found everything. Her camera equipment, her clothes, personal effects. But no Jessica. Mills leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Hunter, forensics found something else. Bone fragments scattered throughout the area. Human bone fragments from at least 7 different individuals. 7 people, minimum. All lured by someone, something, that had been wearing Eddie's dead body like a coat. The local tribal police finally talked to us after we showed them your GPS logs," Mills continued. "Turns out there have been stories about that area for generations. Something they call the hunger walker. Feeds on people who can't resist helping others. Is it gone?" Mills was quiet for a long moment. "The Ute elder I spoke with said that when these entities lose their host body, they have to retreat to wherever they came from to find a new one. Could be years before it resurfaces. Could be decades. Or it could be next week." "Or it could be next week," Mills agreed. which is why we're closing Trail 47 indefinitely and posting warnings about the entire southwest section. Sarah squeezed my hand and I realized she'd been listening to our conversation. Hunter, you're taking medical leave. Extended medical leave. Emma and I need you alive more than the forest needs you. I wanted to argue, to insist that this was exactly why I needed to stay on duty, to protect other people from threats they couldn't understand. But when I looked at Emma sleeping peacefully in her chair, trusting absolutely that Daddy would always come home, I realized Sarah was right. I'd been lucky. Impossibly, incomprehensibly lucky. The next ranger who encountered something like Eddie might not be. Okay, I said. Extended leave it is. But as Mills left and Sarah settled back into her chair, I made myself a promise. When I eventually returned to duty, I'd make sure every ranger in Colorado understood what was really out there in the wilderness. Because Eddie had been right about one thing. People like us can't resist helping others. We just need to be a lot smarter about how we do it. 6 months later, I returned to work with new protocols in place. Rangers now traveled in pairs when investigating missing person cases. We carried enhanced communication equipment and checked in every 30 minutes during searches. Most importantly, we'd developed a code system for identifying potential supernatural threats, based on the detailed logs I'd made during my encounter with the entity that had worn Eddie's corpse. Jessica Martinez was never found, but the bone fragments Mills mentioned led to the closure of 7 missing person cases dating back 15 years. 7 families finally had answers, even if those answers brought more pain than closure. I still work the Colorado forests, but I've never returned to Trail 47. Some rangers think I'm a coward for avoiding the area where I nearly died. Others understand that some kinds of knowledge are too dangerous to revisit. What I learned in that cursed clearing changed how I approach every rescue, every missing person case, every stranger who appears to need help in the wilderness. I still help people. It's who I am, who I'll always be. But now I verify everything, question coincidences, and trust my instincts when they scream warnings I can't rationally explain. Because somewhere in the dark spaces between the trees, something is always waiting for people like me. People whose compassion makes them vulnerable. People who can't resist the sound of someone crying for help. And the only way to keep helping people is to stay alive long enough to recognize when help is exactly what the predator is counting on. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Jessica Martinez. I read every single one. My name is Blake Richardson, and at 6:47 a.m. my radio crackled with the call that would change my life, and my understanding of what's possible in this goddamn universe. Unit 23, we have a code yellow. Missing person report just came in. Sarah's voice cut through the morning static like a rusty blade. 23 years as a forest ranger, and I'd heard that tone maybe 100 times. Parents panicking because little Timmy wandered off the trail for 10 minutes. Hikers who took a wrong turn and spent the night shivering under a pine tree. College kids too drunk to find their own campsite. I was refilling my coffee thermos in the ranger station, already planning my standard speech about staying on marked trails and carrying proper gear. The October air in Olympic National Forest carried that familiar bite of approaching winter, and the 2018 Subaru Outback I'd been driving for 3 years was fogged up from the temperature difference. My iPhone 8 showed 17 missed calls from my wife Jenny, probably reminding me about our daughter Emma's soccer game at 3 p.m. Copy that, Sarah. What's the situation? I keyed the radio, expecting the usual bullshit. 22-year-old female Madison Parker. Last seen yesterday around 4 p.m. near the Hoh River Trail Junction. Family says she was doing some kind of research project for her anthropology degree at UW. I paused, coffee mug halfway to my lips. The Hoh River area was remote, sure, but well marked. Good cell coverage in most spots. Temperature had dropped to 38 degrees last night, cold enough to kill someone without proper gear, but not immediately dangerous for a college kid who presumably had basic outdoor sense. Any indication of foul play? Domestic issues? Mental health concerns? Negative on all counts. Family drove up from Seattle this morning. They're pretty frantic, Blake. The girl's been texting her mom every few hours for the past month. Radio silent since yesterday afternoon. That got my attention. In 23 years, I'd learned to separate real emergencies from parental paranoia, and the texture of Sarah's voice told me this wasn't standard helicopter parent bullshit. I dumped the rest of my coffee into the thermos, grabbed my pack, and checked my gear. Garmin GPS map, 60 Forst, first aid kit, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, 400 lumens LED headlamp with backup batteries, and the standard issue Motorola radio that had saved my ass more times than I could count. I'm en route to the trailhead, ETA 20 minutes. Have you contacted search and rescue? Negative. Family insisted on calling you specifically. Apparently Madison mentioned she'd talked to a ranger about local folklore, and they think it was you. Folklore. Christ. I'd spent 2 decades explaining to tourists that no, Bigfoot wasn't real, and no, the woods weren't haunted by Native American spirits. Madison Parker was probably another wide-eyed college student who'd gotten swept up in local legends instead of paying attention to basic trail safety. The drive to Hoh River Trailhead gave me time to think. October 15th, 2018. I remembered the date because it was the same day the stock market had dropped another 400 points, and Jenny had been stress-eating ice cream while watching the news. The political climate was toxic as usual, but out here in the forest, that shit didn't matter. Out here, reality was simple. Trees, rocks, weather, and the occasional lost idiot who needed rescuing. I'd always prided myself on being rational, evidence-based. When other rangers told stories about weird feelings in certain areas of the forest, I'd roll my eyes and mutter about too much caffeine and too little sleep. When tourists claimed they'd seen strange lights or heard impossible sounds, I'd patiently explain the mating calls of elk, the way fog could distort perception, how your brain played tricks when you were scared and alone in unfamiliar territory. The Parker family was waiting in the parking lot when I arrived. 2 cars with Washington plates, a man and woman in their 50s who looked like they hadn't slept, and a younger guy I assumed was Madison's brother. The mother approached me before I'd even turned off the engine, and I could see the barely controlled panic in her red-rimmed eyes. "Are you Ranger Richardson? Madison mentioned you. She said you knew everything about this area." "Ma'am, I'm Blake Richardson, and I'll do everything I can to find your daughter. Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" What followed was the standard missing person interview, but with details that made my stomach clench. Madison Parker wasn't some naive city girl. She'd been hiking these trails for 3 years as part of her anthropology research. She knew the area, carried proper gear, and had a spotless track record of checking in with her family. More importantly, she'd been researching local folklore and historical sites, specifically focusing on religious structures that predated modern settlement. Religious structures. In 23 years, I'd never heard anyone mention religious structures in this part of the forest. She was particularly interested in some old church, the mother continued, her voice cracking. She said she'd found references to it in historical records, and that you'd confirmed its location. I felt ice water in my veins. "Ma'am, I've never spoken to your daughter about any church. There are no churches in the wilderness area. No structures, period, except for a few old logging cabins that are clearly marked on maps." The family exchanged glances that made my skin crawl. Whatever Madison had told them, she'd been specific enough that they'd driven 5 hours expecting me to know exactly what she was talking about. "She showed us photos," the brother said quietly. "Old stone building overgrown with ivy. Gothic architecture. She said it was about 3 miles off the main trail, following a creek bed that isn't on any official maps. 3 miles off trail, following an unmapped creek. In an area I'd been patrolling for over 2 decades. I keyed my radio. "Unit 23 to base. I'm beginning search operations for Madison Parker. GPS coordinates 47.8606 degree N, 123.9348 degree W. Family reports she was investigating historical structures off-trail. I'll be conducting a grid search starting from the Hoh River Junction. Copy, Unit 23. Weather Service is calling for possible precipitation this afternoon. Temperature dropping to 32 degrees after sunset." 32 degrees. If Madison Parker was injured and stuck overnight without shelter, hypothermia would kill her before I could find her in the morning. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, following the same route Madison had taken 26 hours earlier. The October forest was beautiful in that harsh, indifferent way that made city people uncomfortable. Douglas firs towering 200 feet overhead, creating a canopy so thick that noon looked like twilight, and the kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat. But as I hiked deeper into the wilderness, that silence started feeling wrong. Not peaceful, wrong. In 23 years, I'd learned to read the forest's moods like a sailor reads weather, and something about this particular morning made my shoulders tense and my hand drift unconsciously to the radio on my belt. The first hour was standard search protocol. I followed Madison's known route, looking for footprints, broken vegetation, anything that might indicate where she'd left the main trail. The Hoh River gurgled along beside me, running high from recent rains, and I could see places where someone had stopped to take photos, disturbed gravel, a candy bar wrapper tucked under a rock. But as I reached the 3-mile mark, where the family claimed Madison had turned off trail, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Footprints, fresh footprints, definitely made by hiking boots, leading away from the main trail and following a creek bed that absolutely, definitely was not on any map I'd ever seen. I'd hiked this area hundreds of times. I knew every creek, every ridge, every game trail within a 10-mile radius. But here was a waterway maybe 4 feet wide, running clear and cold between moss-covered stones, cutting through the forest in a direction that didn't match the topography I'd memorized over 2 decades of professional experience. I pulled out my GPS unit and waited for the satellite signal to lock. 47.tx23 to Guyane, 123.9401 Gadig W. According to my device, I was standing in the middle of solid forest with no water features within a quarter mile. My rational brain started working overtime. GPS could be inaccurate under heavy tree cover. Maybe this was a seasonal creek that only flowed during wet weather. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and gotten disoriented. 23 years of experience could be wrong if you were tired, stressed, or distracted by family pressure. But Madison's footprints were clear as daylight in the soft earth beside the water, and they were definitely heading upstream. I keyed my radio. Unit 23 to base. I've located the subject's trail. She appears to have followed an unmapped creek bed approximately 3 miles from the trailhead. I'm continuing pursuit. Copy, Unit 23. Be advised, your signal is getting weak. Maintain regular check-ins. The static was heavier than usual, but that wasn't uncommon in areas with dense tree cover. I clipped the radio back to my belt and started following Madison Parker's footprints into terrain that shouldn't have existed. The creek meandered through the forest in a way that felt wrong. Not geologically wrong, but wrong in some deeper sense that my rational mind couldn't categorize. The water ran uphill in places, or seemed to, creating optical illusions that made me dizzy when I stared too long. The trees on either side grew in patterns that hurt to look at directly, their branches interweaving in geometries that seemed to fold back on themselves. After an hour of hiking, I found Madison's first campsite. She'd stopped here the previous afternoon, judging by the compressed vegetation and a small fire ring built from creek stones. But what made my skin crawl was the arrangement. The stones formed a perfect circle, exactly 6 feet in diameter, with symbols carved into each rock that looked like no Native American petroglyphs I'd ever seen. Symbols that looked fresh, as if they'd been carved recently. With precision tools, I photographed everything with my iPhone, trying to maintain some kind of professional documentation, but my hands were shaking slightly as I worked. In 23 years, I'd never seen anything that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena, human error, or basic psychology. But these symbols, these perfect, precise carvings that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them, didn't fit into any rational category. Madison's trail continued upstream, but now there were additional footprints in the soft earth. Bare feet, human-sized, but with proportions that made me count the toes 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. 6 toes on each foot, long, narrow, with what looked like claw marks extending beyond the toe impressions. My radio crackled. "Unit 23, please respond. We're losing your signal." I keyed the radio, but got nothing but static. My iPhone showed no bars, which wasn't unusual in remote areas, but the GPS was still showing impossible readings. According to the device, I was simultaneously at 3 different locations, all of them overlapping in ways that violated basic physics. The temperature was dropping. My breath came out in visible puffs, even though it had been nearly 50 degrees when I'd started the hike. The quality of light filtering through the canopy had changed, taking on a greenish tint that made everything look underwater. And then I smelled something that made every primitive alarm in my brain start screaming. Incense. Not the pleasant, hippy-dippy stuff you might expect from college students experimenting with meditation. This was older, heavier, with undertones of decay that made my stomach clench. It was coming from upstream, carried on a breeze that felt warm against my face despite the dropping temperature. Madison Parker's footprints led directly toward that smell. I'd been a forest ranger for 23 years. I'd seen bear attacks, hypothermia victims, people who'd fallen from cliffs and survived 3 days with compound fractures. I'd talked suicidal teenagers off ledges and performed CPR on heart attack victims 20 miles from the nearest road. I was trained, experienced, and professionally skeptical about 99% of the weird shit that happened in the wilderness. But as I followed that unmapped creek toward the source of that impossible incense, something in my gut was telling me to turn around, hike back to my vehicle, and call in a full search and rescue team with helicopters and tracking dogs. The rational part of my brain overruled my gut. Madison Parker was a 22-year-old college student who'd been missing for over 24 hours in conditions that could kill her. Whatever weirdness was happening with my GPS and radio equipment could be explained later. My job was to find her and get her home safely. I kept following the creek upstream, and with each step, reality seemed to become more negotiable. The trees were wrong. Not species I didn't recognize. That would have been surprising but explainable. These were Douglas firs and western red cedars that I'd been identifying for 2 decades, but they were growing in patterns that hurt my eyes. Branches that connected between separate trees, forming impossible arches and bridges. Root systems that emerged from the ground, twisted through the air like wooden tentacles, and dove back into the earth 50 feet away. The creek itself was flowing uphill now, definitely uphill, and the water was making sounds that water shouldn't make, not babbling or gurgling, but something that resembled whispered conversations in a language I'd never heard. And then, as I crested a small ridge that absolutely had not been on any topographical map ever created, I saw the church. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Blake Richardson's situation? Comment below. It was exactly as Madison's family had described. Ancient stone construction, Gothic arches, covered with ivy that seemed to move independently of any breeze. But photographs could never have captured the wrongness of the structure, the way it seemed to exist in more dimensions than my brain could process. The building was simultaneously massive and impossibly small, close enough that I could see individual stones in the walls, but distant enough that it would take hours to reach on foot. Old enough that the stonework showed centuries of weathering, but new enough that I could smell fresh mortar. And Madison Parker was walking toward it. I could see her clearly, about a quarter mile ahead, moving with the jerky, mechanical gait of someone who wasn't entirely in control of their own movements. She was wearing the same hiking clothes her family had described, but something about her posture made my throat close up. "Madison," I shouted, and my voice echoed in ways that voices shouldn't echo in forest settings. The sound bounced off trees and rocks, but also seemed to echo from underground and from directions that didn't correspond to any visible surfaces. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence at all, just kept walking toward that impossible church with movements that looked like a marionette being controlled by someone still learning to use the strings. I started running. The distance between us never seemed to change. I ran for what felt like 20 minutes, my legs burning and lungs screaming, but Madison remained exactly the same distance ahead of me. The church loomed larger and smaller simultaneously, its Gothic spires reaching into a sky that had turned the color of old bone. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, gasping and dizzy, I realized that my watch had stopped. The hands were frozen at 9:33 a.m., even though my iPhone, which still showed no signal, claimed it was 2:17 p.m. But that was impossible. I'd only been hiking for 3 hours. I checked my GPS again, and this time the readings made me sit down hard on a moss-covered log. According to the device, I was located at coordinates that placed me approximately 15 miles underground. My radio crackled with static, and for a moment I thought I heard Sarah's voice trying to reach me. But when I keyed the transmitter, the static resolved into something that definitely wasn't human speech. Rhythmic, guttural sounds that might have been chanting. The incense smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. Sweet and cloying, but with undertones that reminded me of things that had been dead for a very long time. It was coming from the church, along with a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones rather than my ears. Madison Parker had reached the church entrance. From my position, I could see her silhouette against massive wooden doors that looked like they'd been carved from a single tree. She paused there for a moment, and I had the crazy hope that she was having second thoughts, that whatever compulsion had brought her here might be wearing off. Instead, she raised her right hand and knocked on the door. 3 measured knocks that echoed across the impossible landscape like thunder. The doors opened. What emerged from the church wasn't anything my brain could properly categorize. It had the rough shape of a human being, but the proportions were wrong in every possible way. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions that violated basic anatomy. It wore what might have been clerical robes, but the fabric seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when it turned to look in my direction, I saw that it had Madison Parker's face. Not similar to her face, not a family resemblance or a coincidental similarity. It had her exact face, down to the small scar on her left cheek that her mother had mentioned during our interview. But that face was attached to something that was definitely not Madison Parker. The thing smiled at me, and Madison's familiar features twisted into an expression of such predatory hunger that I actually stumbled backward and fell on my ass. Then it beckoned for me to approach. I'm not proud of what happened next. 23 years of professional training, 2 decades of talking about courage and preparedness and doing whatever it takes to help people in emergency situations, and when faced with something that didn't fit into my rational worldview, I completely panicked. I turned and ran. But the forest had changed while I'd been focused on the church. The creek I'd followed upstream had vanished, replaced by terrain that looked like no place on earth I'd ever seen. The trees were black now, their bark looking more like insect carapaces than wood, and the ground beneath my feet felt spongy and warm, as if I were running across living tissue. The sky was wrong. Instead of the gray October overcast I'd hiked under all morning, the heavens were a deep purple color that seemed to pulse with its own light. Stars were visible, but they were arranged in patterns that made no sense. Constellations that formed geometric shapes so complex that looking at them made my eyes water and my head spin. I was no longer in Olympic National Forest. I wasn't sure I was still on Earth. My radio crackled again, and this time I heard voices that I recognized. Jenny, my wife, calling my name. Emma, my 8-year-old daughter, crying and asking why Daddy wouldn't come home. My father, who died 6 years ago, telling me that I'd always been a disappointment. But underneath those familiar voices, I could hear something else. The same rhythmic chanting that had been coming from the church getting louder and more insistent. And I realized that the voices of my family were perfectly synchronized with that inhuman chanting, as if they were just another instrument in some cosmic choir. I ripped the radio off my belt and threw it as hard as I could. It landed in something that looked like a bush but screamed when the device hit it. The screaming didn't stop. It was coming from everywhere now. The trees, the ground, the impossible purple sky. A sound like 10,000 voices all experiencing the worst pain imaginable, and all of them blaming me for their suffering. I kept running, but with each step the landscape became more alien. The spongy ground gave way to surfaces that looked like enormous scales. The black trees twisted into spirals that extended infinitely upward, their branches forming patterns that seemed to spell out words in languages that human throats could never pronounce. And behind me, something was following. Something large and patient and absolutely certain that it would catch me eventually. I could hear its footsteps, slow, measured, accompanied by a dragging sound as if it were pulling something heavy across the ground. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, I caught a glimpse of the thing that had been wearing Madison Parker's face. But now it wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, all wearing familiar faces, hikers who'd gone missing over the years, people I'd searched for and never found. But twisted, wrong, animated by something that had no understanding of how human expressions were supposed to work. And at the front of that horrible procession was Madison Parker herself. The real Madison Parker, not the thing that had mimicked her appearance. But she was changed, her eyes black from lid to lid, her mouth stretched into a smile so wide that it had split the corners of her lips. She was carrying something, a book bound in what looked like human skin, with symbols carved into the cover that hurt to look at directly. When she saw me looking, she held up the book and spoke in a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. "Blake Richardson," she said, and her words echoed across the impossible landscape. "Do you want to know what happened to all the people you never found?" I did not want to know. I absolutely, definitely did not want to know. But the book opened itself, pages fluttering in a wind that smelled like centuries of decay, and the knowledge entered my brain whether I wanted it or not. The church wasn't just a building, it was a doorway, a thin place where something vast and hungry had been reaching through the barriers between dimensions for over a century, collecting specific individuals who possessed some quality that it found useful. Madison Parker hadn't stumbled onto the church by accident. She'd been called to it, drawn by the same anthropological curiosity that had made her an ideal candidate. Her research had made her aware of the structure, but that awareness had also made her visible to the thing that dwelled within. And now it was using her, and all the others it had collected over the decades to expand its influence. Each person who entered the church willingly became part of its growing consciousness, adding their knowledge and memories to its understanding of our reality. The missing hikers I'd never found weren't dead. They were still in there, still conscious, still experiencing every moment of their transformation into something that served the entity's incomprehensible purpose. And it wanted me to join them. 23 years, Madison's voice continued, though her lips weren't moving. 23 years of searching for people you could never find, because we took them somewhere you could never look. But we've been watching you, Blake Richardson. We've been learning from you. And now we're ready to offer you the truth you've been seeking your entire career. The procession of twisted figures had reached me now, but instead of attacking, they simply stood in a circle around me, waiting, patient. The thing wearing Madison's face opened the terrible book again, and this time I could see pages covered with photographs. Photographs of every missing person case I'd ever worked, every search and rescue operation that had ended without answers, every family I'd had to tell that their loved one was simply gone, vanished into the wilderness without a trace. "You can have them all back," the thing said. "Every single person you failed to save. They're still alive, Blake Richardson, still waiting for you to rescue them. All you have to do is walk through those doors." The church had followed us. It was right there behind the circle of transformed humans, its Gothic doors standing open to reveal an interior that seemed to extend infinitely inward. I could see people moving in that darkness, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. All the missing hikers and campers and researchers who'd vanished into Olympic National Forest over the past century. And they were calling my name, begging me to help them, to save them. 23 years of professional training told me it was a trap. Everything about this situation violated the laws of physics, biology, and basic reality. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I should run, should find some way back to the real world, should report this to authorities who might actually be equipped to deal with something this far beyond normal human experience. But I could hear Emma crying inside that church, my daughter, who should have been safe at home with her mother preparing for her soccer game. And Jenny's voice, calling for me to help her, to save her from something she didn't understand. "They're not really in there," I said, though my voice sounded weak and uncertain even to me. "Aren't they?" Madison's doppelganger smiled wider, splitting her cheeks. "How can you be sure? In a universe where churches appear in places they shouldn't exist, where GPS coordinates place you 15 miles underground, where time moves backward and water flows uphill. How can you be certain that anything you've ever believed about reality is actually true? The thing was right. Everything I'd used to navigate the world, maps, instruments, scientific understanding, basic logic, had proven useless in this place. If the fundamental laws of reality could be violated this completely, then maybe the voices calling from inside the church really were my family. Maybe all those missing people really were still alive, waiting for me to finally do my job and bring them home. I took a step toward the church doors. The moment my foot moved, every transformed human in the circle began laughing, not with humor, with the kind of anticipation that predators show when they know their prey is about to walk into their trap. The sound was so wrong, so completely outside the range of noises that human vocal cords should be able to produce, that it made my teeth ache. But I could still hear Emma crying, and that sound was more compelling than any rational concern for my own safety. I took another step. The church doors swung wider, revealing glimpses of the impossible space within. Gothic arches that stretched upward farther than any earthly building could support. Stained glass windows that showed scenes from no religion I'd ever encountered. Pews filled with figures that might have been human once, all turning to watch my approach with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. And at the altar, something massive and tentacled and so geometrically complex that my brain refused to process its actual shape. It pulsed with its own light, and each pulse sent ripples through reality itself. The entity that had been using this church as its doorway for over a century, the thing that had been collecting human consciousness like specimens in a jar, the cosmic horror that viewed our entire species as nothing more than interesting insects to be studied and categorized. It was beautiful. Terrifyingly, insanely beautiful in ways that human aesthetic sense was never designed to appreciate. Looking at it filled me with a sense of religious awe so profound that I actually understood why people had built a church around it. And it was looking directly at me. Not with eyes. It didn't have anything as mundane as eyes. But I could feel its attention like a physical weight, examining every thought I'd ever had, every memory I'd ever formed, every emotion I'd ever experienced. It knew me more completely than I knew myself, and it was hungry. Blake Richardson. It spoke without words, its voice resonating in frequencies that made my bones vibrate. The seeker, the one who spends his life searching for the lost. We have been waiting for you. The voices of my family were louder now, more desperate. Emma was screaming for Daddy to help her, and the sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the church, past the altar where the entity waited. Jenny was calling my name, begging me not to leave her alone with the dark things that were reaching for her. I knew it was a trick. Some part of my rational mind was still functioning, still able to recognize that cosmic entities probably didn't need to use family members as bait to lure forest rangers into their influence. But knowing it was a trick didn't make the voices less compelling. And what if it wasn't entirely a trick? What if the entity really did have access to other dimensions, other realities where my family was in danger and needed my help? In a universe where the impossible had become routine, could I risk the possibility that those cries for help were real? I stepped through the church doors. The transformation began immediately. Not physical. That would come later. First, it rewrote my understanding of existence itself. Reality was much larger than human science had ever suspected. Our three-dimensional space was just one layer in an infinite structure of overlapping universes, each one separated by barriers so thin that sufficiently advanced entities could step between them as easily as walking from one room to another. The thing in the church, I still couldn't perceive its true form without my sanity threatening to snap, was one of countless beings that existed in the spaces between realities. To it, our universe was a tidal pool, and humans were fascinating little creatures that occasionally displayed behaviors worth studying. It had been observing our species for millennia, collecting specimens from every era of human development. The church was just its most recent collection point, designed to attract individuals with specific psychological profiles. Seekers, people whose drive to find answers would override their survival instincts. People like me. The knowledge flooded into my consciousness whether I wanted it or not. rewriting everything I'd ever believed about the nature of existence. And with that knowledge came understanding of what the entity wanted from me. It was preparing to expand its collection operations. Instead of waiting for suitable specimens to wander into its influence, it wanted to actively recruit them. And it needed human agents who understood how to move through our society without attracting unwanted attention. Forest rangers were perfect. We had access to remote areas, official authority to investigate disappearances, and the trust of families desperate for answers about their missing loved ones. We could guide specific individuals toward areas where the entity's influence was strongest, ensuring that the most interesting specimens would eventually find their way to collection points like this church. In return, it would give me power, not just knowledge of cosmic truth, but actual ability to manipulate reality within certain limits. I would become something more than human, able to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, functionally immortal and possessed of understanding that would make Einstein look like a kindergarten student. All I had to do was surrender my individual consciousness and become part of its greater intelligence. The offer was presented not as coercion, but as opportunity, a chance to transcend the limitations of human existence and become part of something infinitely larger and more significant than any single person could ever be. It was the most seductive offer I'd ever received, and the most terrifying, because I wanted to accept it. Standing in that impossible church surrounded by the transformed remnants of people who'd made the same choice, I genuinely wanted to surrender my individual humanity and merge with something cosmic and eternal. The entity's offer wasn't just intellectually compelling. It felt like the completion of a search I'd been conducting my entire life without realizing it. Every missing person case I'd ever worked, every time I'd hiked into the wilderness looking for someone who'd vanished without explanation, I'd been unconsciously seeking this exact revelation. The truth that human existence was just a tiny fragment of something much larger and more complex than our species had ever imagined. But as the transformation began, as I felt my individual consciousness starting to dissolve into the entity's collective intelligence, one last rational thought managed to surface. Emma's soccer game was at 3 p.m., and I'd promised to be there. It was such a small thing, such a mundane, ordinary human concern compared to the cosmic significance of what was being offered to me. But that promise to my 8-year-old daughter represented something the entity couldn't understand or replicate. Love that was completely irrational and absolutely unconditional. The love I felt for my family wasn't based on their usefulness or their potential contribution to some greater purpose. I loved them because they existed, because they were themselves, because their happiness mattered more to me than my own survival or understanding or transcendence. And that love gave me the strength to do something the entity hadn't expected. I said no, not out loud. My vocal cords were no longer entirely under my control. But somewhere deep in what remained of my individual consciousness, I rejected the offer. I chose ignorance over enlightenment, mortality over transcendence, human limitation over cosmic truth. The entity's reaction was immediate and violent. Not anger, something that vast and ancient didn't experience human emotions. But surprise, and beneath that, something that might have been disappointment. It had been collecting humans for centuries, and every single one had eventually chosen transcendence over their original existence. The offer of cosmic understanding was simply too compelling for human psychology to resist indefinitely. But I had something the other specimens hadn't possessed, a reason to remain limited that was stronger than my desire to become unlimited. The church began to collapse around us. Not physically. The stone walls and Gothic arches remained intact, but the reality distortions that had allowed the structure to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously were breaking down as the entity withdrew its influence. The other, transformed humans began screaming as they felt themselves being pulled back toward individual consciousness. They'd become accustomed to existing as part of something larger, and the prospect of returning to ordinary human awareness was terrifying for them. Madison Parker was closest to me when the reversal began. As her individual personality reasserted itself, I could see the cosmic knowledge draining from her eyes, replaced by confusion and terror as she remembered who she'd been before entering the church. "What's happening?" she gasped. staring at her hands as if she'd never seen them before. Where are we? What is this place? The church was fading now, becoming translucent as the barriers between dimensions reasserted themselves. Through the dissolving walls, I could see Olympic National Forest returning to normal. Douglas firs and western red cedars growing in familiar patterns. October sunlight filtering through a canopy that followed ordinary laws of physics. We're going home, I told Madison, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. The entity's influence was withdrawing, but I had no idea what that meant for those of us who'd been caught in its collection area when the reversal began. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the entity itself, no longer beautiful and seductive, but revealed in its true form. Something so alien and incomprehensible that my brain simply shut down rather than try to process what I was seeing. When I woke up, I was lying on familiar ground beside the Hoh River Trail, with Madison Parker unconscious next to me and my radio crackling with search and rescue chatter. Unit 23, please respond. We have helicopter support en route to your last known coordinates. I keyed the radio with trembling hands. Unit 23 to base. I have located Madison Parker. She's alive but unconscious. We need immediate medical evacuation. My watch showed 3:15 p.m. I'd missed Emma's soccer game. The official report was straightforward. Madison Parker had suffered severe hypothermia after becoming lost in an unmapped area of Olympic National Forest. Ranger Blake Richardson had located her using standard search protocols and provided emergency first aid until helicopter evacuation could be arranged. Both individuals had been treated for exposure and released after 48 hours of observation. The GPS anomalies were attributed to equipment malfunction caused by extreme weather conditions. The radio communication problems were explained by atmospheric interference. Madison's confused statements about churches and cosmic entities were dismissed as hypothermia-induced hallucinations. Everyone involved agreed that it had been a successful rescue operation, with no unusual circumstances worth investigating further. But Madison Parker and I knew the truth. We'd seen something that human beings aren't supposed to see, and that knowledge changed us in ways that no one else could understand. Madison completed her anthropology degree, but switched her focus from historical research to contemporary urban legends. She never went camping again, and her senior thesis was titled, "The Psychological Function of Horror Stories in Post-Industrial Society." I remained a forest ranger for another 7 years, but I never again worked a missing person case without wondering whether the individual had truly gotten lost, or if they'd been called to some thin place where reality becomes negotiable. I attended Emma's next soccer game, and the one after that, and every game she played until she graduated high school and went to college, because I'd learned something in that impossible church that was more valuable than cosmic truth. The ordinary love between family members is the most powerful force in any universe, and protecting that love is worth remaining ignorant about everything else. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed next to Jenny, I can still hear the entity calling to me, offering knowledge and transcendence and the chance to become part of something infinitely larger than human existence. And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to answer. Because the truth is, once you've seen behind the veil of reality, once you've glimpsed the vast intelligences that regard human civilization the way we regard ant colonies, it becomes very difficult to find meaning in ordinary human concerns. The mortgage payment is due, Emma needs braces, Jenny's worried about her mother's health, and I need to fix the leaking faucet in the guest bathroom. These things matter because they matter to people I love, but they feel unbearably small compared to the cosmic perspective I was offered. I chose humanity over transcendence, and most days I'm grateful for that choice. But I'd be lying if I said it was easy to live with. The entity is still out there, still collecting specimens, still offering transcendence to anyone willing to surrender their individual consciousness. And Madison Parker wasn't its only success. There are others spread throughout our society who accepted its offer and now serve as recruitment agents for its expanded collection operations. I see them sometimes, in grocery stores and coffee shops and at Emma's school events. People who look human but move with the subtle wrongness of individuals whose consciousness has been fundamentally altered. They watch me and I watch them, and we recognize each other across the fragile boundaries of ordinary reality. They're waiting for me to change my mind, waiting for some crisis or tragedy or moment of despair that will make the offer of cosmic understanding more compelling than the promise I made to be home for dinner. So far, I've resisted, but I'm getting older, and Emma is growing up. And there are nights when the ordinary concerns of human existence feel too small to contain the knowledge I carry. The entity is patient. It has eternity to work with, and it knows that eventually, everyone breaks. But not today. Today I have a leaking faucet to fix, and Emma has homework that needs checking, and Jenny made pot roast that smells like home and safety and everything worth protecting in this small, precious, unbearably limited human world. The cosmic truth can wait until tomorrow. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Madison Parker. I read every single one. What would you do if faced with cosmic transcendence versus human love? Would Blake's choice have been yours?